Hey, food and drink people in the next room, finish helping yourselves and join us. There will be further opportunities for food and drink. Well, just water is fine. Well, you can have more later. Welcome, everybody. Happy New Year. I'm Checker Finn with the Fordham Institute. Welcome to the fifth in our series of 10 get-togethers to talk about Education 2020 with prominent thinker-writers, mostly right-leaning and fresh thinking when it comes to the education issues that plague us. And our goal, with the help of the Hoover Institution, our host today, and the Charen Family Foundation, which has helped to underwrite the food and things like that. We are happy to see you and to try to promote some fresh thinking about education and get us beyond some of the cul-de-sacs in which we think education policy and education thought have gotten stuck in recent years. And it is my great pleasure to kick off this afternoon by introducing Mona Charen, a friend, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, author of a terrific new book, Sex Matters, How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense. And she has written a great New Year's gift, a belated early President's Day gift. Even a Valentine seems appropriate, doesn't it? So we're very glad to have Mona here, and I have read her paper, and I think you're in for a treat. So I'm not going to say more. A little bit is in your program. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Checker, and thanks to the Thomas Fordham Foundation for sponsoring this project, and to Hoover for inviting us. Appreciate that very much. I'd like to kick off by asking you all to picture a 16-year-old young woman. She wears glasses, looks kind of scholarly, very pretty, very smart, comes from a bad neighborhood, goes to a charter school, and she is just on the cusp of the rest of her life. What do we want her to know? What is it our obligation to teach her? Well, there is broad agreement that American students need a good grounding on core academic subjects. There's a great fashion for STEM subjects. Lots of people think that an arts curriculum is key to a well-rounded education and so forth. But what about life lessons? There's broad agreement that certain life lessons should be part of the curriculum. For example, in almost all the schools in our country, this young lady will be told that she should avoid smoking, that she should get enough sleep, that she should exercise regularly, that she should even use birth control to avoid STDs and pregnancy. But unfortunately, when it comes to other aspects of life where life advice might be really important, the consensus that we should do this dissolves. This is where tangled questions of morality and paternalism come into play, and schools are a little bit shy about discussing these matters. But I think it's time to retire our reticence about discussing the importance of life decisions. There are only a few experimental programs in America where that 16-year-old will be told what the Brookings Institution scholars Isabel Sawhill and Ron Haskins called in 2003 the success sequence. Namely, do 3 things in your life and you are vanishingly unlikely to wind up in poverty. Those 3 things: finish high school, get a full-time job, any job, and wait until you are married to have children. That's the success sequence. The data are striking. Haskins and Sawhill calculated that those who follow all 3 norms have only a 2% chance of living in poverty and a 75% chance of joining the middle class. And if people were to follow these steps, child poverty would be drastically reduced. So that is the stark fact that too many shrink from confronting. Unwed childbearing increases poverty. It ought to be a simple thing, you would think, to counsel kids to avoid it But in fact, when it came to teenage pregnancy, the nation did achieve something like consensus to do just that. And it worked. But when it comes to advising against unwed pregnancy for those over 18, cultural leaders fall silent. There are a lot of reasons. In past decades, the topic of family breakdown carried a racial charge. In the mid to late 20th century, rates of unwed parenting were dramatically higher in the African American community than among whites or others. In 1965, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued his famous report on the black family, the illegitimacy rate among African Americans was 23%, compared with 3% for whites. In the intervening decades, the stark contrast between black families and others has faded, but not for good reasons. It's because everybody else in our society has come to resemble more the African American community. Now, family structure is a key variable affecting upward mobility. And it should, you would think, commend the topic to those, especially on the left, who seem preoccupied with inequality. Income gaps have been increasing over the course of the past 50 years. Left-leaning analysts regard the income gap as potentially catastrophic for social cohesion. New York Times columnist Paul Krugman spoke for many when he said, describing our current era as a new Gilded Age or Belle Epoque is not hyperbole, it's the simple truth. And you've heard similar things from Barack Obama and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Yet, for all the pained concern among progressives about the rich getting richer, they've turned their faces away from one of the chief causes of intergenerational poverty, the decline of marriage. The past few decades have offered prodigious evidence that family structure is key to life success. College-educated Americans, that is the upper one-third of our society on the income scale, faithfully follow the success sequence steps. At the other end of the spectrum, less educated Americans have more disordered and chaotic homes. In fact, the sociologist Andrew Charen has observed that America holds the dubious distinction of having the most chaotic adult relationships in the developed world. We cannot say for certain that adhering to bourgeois virtues like work, marriage, and graduating from high school or college, that these cause success. We can obviously, correlation is not causation, as everyone knows, but correlations shouldn't be lightly dismissed either. For example, following up on the Haskins-Sawhill work, Wendy Wang and Brad Wilcox of the Institute for Family Studies looked at how the millennial generation is doing on these scores, and they found, very similar to the Haskins and Sawhill work, that 97% of millennials who followed all three steps are in the middle class or above by the time they reach the prime years of young adulthood, and among those who don't, rates of poverty are much higher. So an encouraging piece of this news is that among millennials who do follow the success sequence, even those who came from poor, disadvantaged backgrounds wind up doing very well. 80% of those with lower income backgrounds made it into the middle or upper income brackets when they followed all three steps. So as I said, our culture has become bifurcated. Among the highly educated elite, the upper one-third, unwed parenting, and even divorce are now incredibly uncommon. 67% of children whose parents are college graduates grew up with both of their biological parents. By contrast, among high school graduates, only 33% of kids live with their married parents. And among high school dropouts, the data are exactly reversed. 67% of millennials who lacked a high school diploma had a baby before marriage. The success sequence pays off. African Americans who married before having children were almost twice as likely to be in the middle or upper income category as those who had children first. And for those who followed all three steps, 84% were in the middle or upper income brackets by young adulthood. Okay, so it works. But young people who come from certain neighborhoods where marriage and work and so forth are not norms, a lot of them are unaware of their own capacity to shape their destinies. A young woman who was featured at an American Enterprise Institute panel on the success sequence reported that no one in her world talked about the importance of following these 3 steps. Another said that it was her impression that marriage was something you did if you were very much in love, but it was utterly unrelated to childbirth or a life plan. She herself came from a single-parent home. When Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, the city ran a series of public service campaigns conveying some of the statistics about these matters, and it provoked a backlash. State Senator Liz Krueger said, "This campaign seems laser-focused on shaming already struggling teen parents, or ludicrously convincing teens not to get pregnant because really bad things will happen," unquote. Planned Parenthood objected that the campaign creates stigma, hostility, and negative public opinions about teen pregnancy and parenthood, unquote. Well, yes, and that was the goal. Is it better to leave teenagers ignorant of the consequences of such choices? Ian Rowe, who has also participated in this project and founded the single-sex public prep schools, charter schools, speaks of the uphill battle that he is waging to get educators to take on this responsibility. Public prep schools are in the South Bronx and Lower Manhattan, and students are from disadvantaged backgrounds. And Rowe doesn't dispute that racism and other social ills place obstacles in the path of students. But the kids, he says, they cannot, they have no power to rid society of ancient prejudices, of racism, of sexism, of various kinds of disadvantages. But what they do have direct control over is the choices that they make. And the data are overwhelming that even in a world afflicted with racism and other ills, those decisions matter. Now, some teachers are concerned that mentioning norms like work and marriage unfairly stigmatizes the already marginalized, and they fear that including these norms in classroom curricula may hurt the feelings of the students' parents, many of whom will not have followed the success sequence themselves. And by the way, some of the teachers may not have themselves. So I think you have to be sensitive to that and recognize that the way you phrase things is going to be important, and you don't want to unnecessarily alienate people or speak in language that's too moralistic. But we can't be too delicate about it either, because that carries costs. In the name of not hurting the parents' or teachers' feelings, the children may be deprived of essential facts, and that seems an awfully steep price to exact. And by the way, it's not necessarily one that the parents themselves would choose. As Isabel Sawhill said to me, most parents want what's best for their kids, even if they themselves didn't do it. So, you know, if a parent is a high school dropout, she's not going to object if you say to her daughter, you really ought to stay in school. So most of the resistance to teaching the success sequence, I would suggest, comes in the form of vague discomfort. But there are a few more pointed critiques as well. Cato Institute's Michael Tanner has argued that racism, sexism, and economic dislocation are responsible for many poor people choosing to have children outside marriage. And I'm skeptical, honestly, about this. I mean, it is hard to square with the fact that in, say, 1965, when racism and discrimination, sexism were far more pervasive and living standards were far lower than today, 3/4 of black children, for example, were born to married parents. There are other reasons to question that assumption as well. The economic dislocation in America's rural communities too. There's reason to doubt that that's the reason they're not marrying, but I'll get into that more if in the Q&A if people are interested. The Progressive Policy Institute's Matt Brunig thinks that the success sequence is actually a sham, he says, because among those 3 steps, work does all the work, in his phrasing. He says if the worker is making minimum wage, even if he works full-time, he will not be poor. Therefore, the other parts of this are just your cultural preferences. You're trying to just impose them. But I don't think that is a valid critique either, because look, it overlooks a big fact of life, which is women tend to have children, and when they do, it's very hard to maintain a full-time job. At that time of her life, there is nothing better than having a husband who can help support the family. And then looming over the success sequence debate is the shadow of the culture wars about teaching birth control versus abstinence, which has come up even recently with the Trump administration's decision to cut some $200 million in funding for teen pregnancy prevention programs. I would desperately hope that teaching the success sequence not become mired in that particular swamp. As the Child Trends Foundation acknowledges, there is evidence that some abstinence programs succeed, as do some comprehensive sex education curricula. The key challenge, in my judgment, is to decide as a society that promoting the success sequence is worthwhile. Schools already teach most of the behaviors that lead to good decision making. We are awash, actually, in teen pregnancy avoidance programs. The Office of Adolescent Health at the Department of Health and Human Services maintains a list of hundreds of successful programs, as does the National Conference of State Legislatures. The Affordable Care Act included funding for lessons on healthy relationships, communication skills, conflict avoidance, and so on. These programs have been part of a culture-wide push to discourage teen pregnancy. And of course, it's impossible to say for certain how much any one program contributed, but we do know that something worked. The National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, the HBO show 16 and Pregnant, the hundreds of state, local, and federal education programs, and celebrity PSAs have had noticeable effects. Between 1991 and 2014, the teen pregnancy rate declined by 52%. The effort to discourage teen pregnancy had one huge advantage: consensus. With rare exceptions, left and right agreed that delaying childbearing until adulthood is a worthy aim. There's every reason to extend that same consensus to the success sequence. The debate about poverty, disadvantage, racism, and social ills will continue, but is there any doubt that individuals, even those from unfortunate homes, have some power to shape their own destinies? It's even arguable that getting educated, working, and waiting until marriage to have children leads to better outcomes for men, women. Sorry, I meant to say, is it even arguable that it leads to better outcomes for men, women, and especially for children? Think about that 16-year-old young lady who is growing up in a community where education, work, and marriage are all ailing. She faces many obstacles, but she may be unaware of the ladders up. Students from poor backgrounds often overestimate the obstacles to their success. Many imagine, for example, that college is out of reach because of the cost. And one of the things that Ian Rowe does at the charter schools that he runs is he makes it a point to tell his students that full scholarships are available for students with family incomes below a certain amount. This is a thunderclap to a lot of kids. Well, just as poor students should know that the best colleges are available to them if they are academically prepared, shouldn't they know that certain personal choices have a track record? The tools to teach the success sequence are readily available. The Dibble Institute, for example, has created a widely imitated curriculum that's used at many private schools called Relationship Smarts, that mentions the success sequence as part of a package about healthy sexuality, relationships, conflict resolution, and so forth. The public prep schools, the Ian Rowe schools, employ as their base text the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens by Sean Covey, and then they add to it with some of the other lessons that they have found, and they've also invited in near-peer counselors, students who are just a little older than high school age, because they find the kids are most receptive to that. And other programs that I have looked at also stress the importance of near peers. There is a wealth of data that these techniques work, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. teach it as part of career readiness or health or sex ed. People can consult the Dibble Institute, or they can consult the Catholic school curricula on self-control, which have shown good results. There are a million character education programs, and many of the myriad efforts under the rubric of the Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. We educate our children for life success, not just for academic achievement. We warn against smoking, illegal drugs, and other hazards. Can we, in good conscience, withhold the facts about the centrality of education, work, and family? They are the indispensable building blocks, not just of financial success, but of health and happiness. Young people from homes and neighborhoods that don't convey this reality deserve to hear it from someone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Join me, and let's get into it, and shortly invite all of you to join as well, as we also have a video audience today and forever after, because these events do appear on the Fordham and Hoover websites, and a lot of people have been watching them after the fact. So, Mona, the schools can certainly do awareness, and should. No, I'm not going to challenge that. I worry a little bit about the tendency in our society to lay too many of our social problems on schools to solve.
Right.
We have layered on, drug education, obesity education, alcohol, smoking, all these things you mentioned, and more. And I do wonder sometimes whether this doesn't actually let others off the hook. That the sort of assumption that schools will take care of it means we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's now the school's problem to solve.
Right.
Does this worry you?
Here's what I would say. Of course, one of the reasons that we pile so many obligations on schools is that other civic institutions are in bad shape.
Yeah.
Churches, community organizations, civil society. But what I would hope to see if I could wave a magic wand, I would create a program akin to the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, to prevent unwed pregnancy. And I would make Barack Obama the chairman.
Michelle Obama, surely.
Both of them.
Okay.
Barack Obama has given terrific speeches on the importance of fatherhood, on the importance of families. He's talked about what it meant for him to have missed out on having a dad, and how much he felt that the most important thing he did was to be there for his daughters and so forth. I wouldn't leave out civil society. I would hope to see the celebrities get into it, and I would hope to see churches and community groups, because honestly, I do not think there is anything. We're enmeshed right now in a debate, certainly on the right, over how we got here. How did we get to a point where so many people are dying from diseases of despair, and where the male labor participation rate is so low, even though the economy is thriving, and these various other troubles. And some people, like Orrin Cass, have been suggesting, well, really it's about work, and we definitely, we have to improve work because that's the key to everything. And I guess I'm interested in that perspective, but I'm skeptical that that's actually it's part of it, but I actually think, based on the research that I did for my other book, Sex Matters, that the key is communities, and the key to communities is families, and therefore we really have to have a concerted effort to shore up family life.
Okay, so schools as part of a fabric, a broader campaign, not as sort of solely responsible for dealing with this. Because as I look at, schools are already sort of working on getting graduation rates up, and they're up. They're working on career readiness, college and career readiness. There's some bit of a resurgence, rekindling of even career and technical education. Working on adolescent pregnancy, as you already said, with some success, or something is succeeding, because the teen pregnancy rate is down, even though the all long-term big picture illegitimacy rate is so up. Yes, there's almost a crossing of lines here, isn't there? teen pregnancy rates improve while out of wedlock rates worsen?
Out of wedlock rates in the last few years have ticked down a tiny bit.
They have?
So yes, just a bit. So
Okay.
there's that.
So the elements of this package, so to speak, this sequence, are already in the works, including in the education system. Again, the teen pregnancy, graduate, be ready for work. Those are sort of already on the table. They're not pulled together.
Correct. And to quote another young person who was asked about this very question, she said, well, maybe if it were presented as just as a tool, that the success sequence is a tool to a good life.
Mm-hmm. I do worry, and you got into this a little bit, about the sort of correlation problem here, or almost the chicken-egg problem here. Certainly, there's no disputing that people that follow the success sequence do better. There's also no disputing that people who know they're going to go to college and do in fact go to college are far more likely to follow the success sequence.
That is true. But it, looked at through a certain lens, you could almost say, well, isn't that so unfair to the kids who are born into single-parent homes in neighborhoods where nobody's married, that the secret sauce to success is being kept from them? The kids in the upper tier, they're learning it with their mother's milk, as it were, and the other kids are not even exposed to the fact that this is important.
Well, I've certainly run into the counterpart with respect to college. In my own work on the advanced placement program, the efforts to get more poor kids into AP classes include not just getting them into the classes, but raising their consciousness about going to college. And the fact that they could go to a good college, they can already do college level work, they can in fact start college with a leg up on it. So there's a lot of kind of possibility raising going along with the sort of the actuality of let's open the classroom door and get more kids into that room.
Right.
So yes, I agree that the consciousness raising side of this is something within the power of schools and other institutions of civil society to do something about. So let's come back to the sort of squeamishness issue on the left, and the kind of preachy or the preachy problem on the right.
Yeah.
Is the squeamishness about I didn't do it myself, or is it about race, or is it about I don't want to impose my values? Where's the squeamishness on the left? And then why do conservatives always sound so kind of superior and kind of moralistic when they turn on to this topic? Not you.
So I'm smiling because I'm reflecting that conservatives have lost some credibility on this matter in the last couple of years, now that the president who represents the Conservative Party doesn't represent any ethics that anybody recognizes.
Yeah,
So they've lost a little bit of moral high ground there. But look, I do think that the squeamishness, this is really a hard problem. This is where the rubber meets the road, because people who are completely committed to the idea that families are optional, and that the most important thing in life is choice, and that the most important thing is to call everything a family. Family is love. Family isn't necessarily the old traditional mother, father, children. In fact, you'll sometimes even hear people put it this way. They'll say, when they're disparaging marriage, they'll say, the old model of mother, a single earner, husband, wife, family. Well, who said anything about a single earner? I mean, that's, anyway. There is a tremendous amount of cultural conflict over what families should be, and I don't want to pretend that won't be an issue, but I would challenge people who want to say that any kind of family is just as good as any other to justify that based on outcomes for children, because the data are overwhelming that they're not all the same, that being raised as heroic a job as many single parents do, it's just incontrovertible that raising children is difficult, and the outcomes are much better when you have two parents.
And at least in my experience watching people I know, it also works when you've got two dads or two moms. That can be a very successful family as well with two parents.
Yes, and there are just a few little things that you have to do differently to make
Yes.
sure yeah.
But that's a two-parent family as well, and kids, at least two are looked after properly, seem to do just fine in those circumstances. So
Oh,
what
and
about
by the way, in
Yeah.
single-sex couples,
Yeah.
it turns out that at least according to a recent New York Times story,
Yeah.
there tends to be a sort of bifurcation of roles, just as with opposite-sex couples.
I'm not a bit surprised.
Yeah.
I do most of the cooking in my house.
There you
and
go.
My wife washes the dishes, willingly. I would say. So what about the preachy problem? How can, aside from the moral high ground issue that you already mentioned, is there a way for not just conservatives, people who want to talk to kids about this topic, to avoid sounding like I'm better than your mother?
Well, first of all, I would hope that the parents would be brought into this. Maybe
Okay.
these could be after-school programs or whatever, and the parents could be participants, which would be helpful so that the kids won't feel that they're somehow betraying their parents if they're participating in this. But look, I mean, again, we didn't hesitate when it came to discouraging teen pregnancy. That had an element of preachiness to it, and yet we felt that the data were so strong that even though this does represent, I guess, a certain kind of sexual freedom, it's not one that people should take advantage of. And so, or at least if they do, they should be aware that there are really, really serious consequences. And one way, look, I would approach these teenagers are not perfect decision makers.
I've seen a few. Raised a few. Couple.
But yeah, me too. But they are not. They're not children, and you can present data to them. You can show them the facts.
Yeah.
And you can let them know that there are trade-offs in life and that nothing is without consequence.
If pregnancy avoidance is one of the goals here, which I should be, you probably don't care, or maybe you do, whether it's birth control or abstinence?
I don't know. I don't want to get bogged down in that debate. I mean, I think for parochial schools who want to teach abstinence and then also talk about the success sequence, great. For public schools in conservative parts of the country, if they want to do that, wonderful. If Boston or Baltimore doesn't want to teach abstinence, they want to teach birth control, fine. Okay,
so we can be agnostic on that. The desirable goal is that you not be burdened as a single parent before you are a successful adult, or ever as a single parent.
Or a married adult.
Married adult. Okay, got that. So why is the success sequence just in recent weeks coming under various kinds of challenge in the on TV and in blogs and in newspaper articles? Why are people beginning to sort of say, I'm not sure that's right anymore?
I think it's I think it ties into a debate that we've had before, and you see these patterns reasserting themselves again and again and again. The debate about what went wrong in the inner cities, right? There was work by William Julius Wilson and others suggesting that the reason illegitimacy spiked the way it did in the late 60s and early 70s and into the 1970s and 80s was that the good jobs had left the cities, and that this was why people were having children out of wedlock. And or at least that's what some more sort of liberal analysts said. Conservatives said, no, that's not the reason. It's lack of morality or something.
That's
now,
what I meant by preachy. But
yeah,
yes,
no, they
yes.
said that. They said that.
Yes.
And it's those, those black people.
They're
They don't
badly
behave.
behaved.
They don't behave right. Yeah. And then when the same sort of pattern began to be shown among white people not getting married, having children out of wedlock, guess what idea came back? It's the loss of manufacturing jobs. That's what's causing all of this. It's not immorality. It's not whatever. Look,
I don't think it's useful to call it immorality at any stage. I think when you talk to that 16-year-old that I'm talking about, and I actually have a particular girl in mind, but I've met many of them, but when you talk to them, I mean, you can't expect them to have a firmly established moral code when nobody has given them one. I mean, they're kids. And so, you know, and the social norms that have developed came to us through our entire culture. I mean, the whole U.S. society decided that we were going to have a sexual revolution, that we were going to eschew the old standards about family formation and all of that. And so it does require grappling with that in a serious way and saying, you know, that was probably a wrong turn. And it's nobody's fault, but if we want people to have what they need, what do babies need when they come into this world? They need the love and support of two parents who love them. They need security. They need order, reliability, and connections to others. And we're learning that because the sexual revolution weakened those family bonds and weakened our social cohesion, that people are lonely and unhappy and a little lost. And I think that that is a deep rethinking that needs to happen about what people need to thrive, and a return to the idea that we're not going to have thriving communities without the original building blocks, which is the family.
So a little bit of this is also the sort of bowling alone problem. The fact that people are no longer going to their bowling league. They're staying home and looking at their screen.
Yeah, that's right. And
not interacting
and
with
I
other.
can testify for myself that looking at a screen is depressing. Okay,
It is depressing, and I'm not sure it's helping your bowling score either.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back, though, to the sort of call it the policy role here in education, because I understand the cultural shift and even the movement idea that you're talking about and the importance of those. What would be if you were a state in charge of the K-12 system, and I'm still stuck on the Maryland State Board of Education at this moment myself, what should a State Board of Education think about doing to bring about any of the things you're recommending?
I would start by talks by young women and men who are 20, 21, 22, who have followed the success sequence and can talk about their own experiences.
Well, no, that's a good idea, but that's not a policy exactly. That's not something that a public official could say, let's do the following. Let's change this regulation or this law or this curriculum or this teacher certification requirement, or what's a thing that you could do?
You're in the weeds of education, bureaucracies, and so forth, and I'm not, so I don't know which levers you would have to push.
Okay, we will get the audience to contribute to that, the answer to that question.
Okay.
And we're about to turn to the audience, but I think we do need to ask, with respect to the education part anyway, we've got the federal programs, other than the pregnancy avoidance programs that you mentioned, I don't think come near this, other than stay in school campaigns.
No.
The state stuff I don't know about. I'm not aware of it in Maryland, and there may be other places where there's a state function. Local districts, charter schools, you mentioned Ian's charter school, and they are, of course, charter schools and private schools are basically free to teach almost whatever they want. So they have a lot of flexibility to kind of develop this or take one of these proven programs that you alluded to at the end and implement it. Again, though, that's not a policy solution. That's a kind of an individual school doing the right thing solution, which I'm all for. So, all right, so we're going to open up. We've got a few minutes for you all to ask questions of Mona or share your thought briefly with Mona and me. So who's gonna kick it off? Go ahead. And we've got mics coming around so that the video audience will be able to hear you. And who are you?
Well, my name is Jing Hong from National School Boards Association.
Okay. Policy person.
Yes. So I would like to follow the question you asked about the policy.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the school counseling and the counselors? And what is their role in these kind of program, to have this program implemented in schools?
Excellent question, and a key role. It's burdened by the fact that mostly counselors are found only in high schools, and some of this ought to happen in middle schools and even primary schools. It's further burdened by the fact that high school counselors in your typical public high school have 500 kids that they're responsible for. And by the time they get their programs worked out and their courses changed and their college applications made and all that stuff, there's not a lot of time left over for what you might call personal counseling. Some schools in some places, of course, also have social workers and psychologists on the team. So you can broaden what you're asking about counselors and say this whole team of other adults that are attached to some schools, though not all schools, can participate in this project that we're talking about. But counselors, I think they may also share in the squeamishness problem of, I'm happy to tell you what colleges to apply to, but I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, because that would be intruding into your personal space. I don't know to what extent that's an issue, or to what extent counselors can be counseled to make this a part of their portfolio. Thoughts on your part on this?
I would just say that I'm a little bit wary of putting it on their shoulders, because then it would just be in one-on-one sessions with the students, and we wouldn't really know what went on and whether they were accurately portraying the statistics to the kids, and phrasing it in a way that would be non-offensive, and it leaves a little bit too much discretion to the individual counselor that they might not use it appropriately.
You can come back with another one if you want. Lady in the back. Yes, you. Who are you?
I'm Helene Miller, former DC Public Schools counselor.
Welcome. Counselor.
All right.
All right.
And I was wondering whether or not a counselor or counselors could create, using one of the curriculums or something similar to the curriculums, and just create the so-called extra classroom or after-school activity where students are either funneled in or encouraged to volunteer in. That would give you more of a larger audience, and you're not going one-on-one, or you say one thing to one child and something else to another child. Would
Right.
that be feasible?
Yeah, I love that idea, and there are examples of it. I've talked to some people who are doing similar things. There was one out in Kansas. They got a little bit of pushback from the school board. I don't know why, but there's something going on there. But yeah, that seems to me a great idea. These also can be funded by private foundations who are looking for ways to help kids improve their lives. The Best Friends Foundation that Elaine Bennett did was an after-school program, and in addition to teaching something like the success sequence, they also did dance and peer counseling and various other kinds of things. So.
The volunteer aspect of this for the kids has also got something to be said for it, in that I could be a lot more direct in talking to kids who come there of their own volition than in a compulsory setting, where
Right.
I might have to be a little warier of upsetting them or upsetting their parents or something because they didn't have a choice about being there, like the parents that get angry over sex education in schools. So I don't want to talk about sex education in a mandatory situation, because the parents might come and complain about me to the school board. But if it's a voluntary after-school thing, especially if it's labeled Success in Life, are you interested?
Yeah.
Come if you are.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you what it takes to be successful in life. You can be very much more direct, I think, in a voluntary situation. Of course, that may also mean you miss the kids that most need the input, so there's that trade-off. Sir.
Yeah, my name is Carl Polzer, and my work, first, most pertinent, I'm a father and a husband. I have 2 kids, and I have a nuclear family. So I also work on a project that's exploring capitalism and how to make it more inclusive, addressing some of the issues you raised. So, and I've read Isabel's book and been in correspondence with her, and I agree with the sequence, the three elements of it. But I think I will challenge you is, are you really looking at all the audiences you need to look at by focusing on the lower income people? Because in terms of the U.S. Birth rate's going down, and we almost don't have enough now to replenish the workforce we have. We could end up being like Japan. It seems like we're relying a lot on the lower income folks. In fact, 40 to 48%, depends what study you look at, of the births in the country are on Medicaid, paid for by Medicaid. So by definition, lower income. So it's almost like you've got a lot more, according to Milanovic's work show and others, that a lot of the inequalities due to people with income and wealth tend to marry each other now.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't they have more kids? They have the capacity. They know about they've been educated.
And they're married.
And they're married, but they ain't having kids. And Schumpeter actually gives us the answer. I mean, like from 80 years ago, I've been reading his book on capitalism. There's a tremendous incentive in capitalism, utilitarianism, and that's the yardstick you're using about success, is do you enter the middle class? To have fewer kids. That way you can have more wealth. Mm-hmm. If you have a family, you just reduce the denominator. So I think that's where a lot of the answer for our country would be with the middle class. And let's get to work.
But you're talking about a pronatalist policy in order to do something about the population crash. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is a slightly different question. I have to confess that I'm down with the success sequence, and I think it's great for people to be able to enter the middle and even the upper classes if they can. That's wonderful. But my chief concern is that I want people to have stable, happy, connected lives. And that, I think, it's hard to have without family life. Much harder. It's not impossible, but it's much harder. And so my chief concern is with people's emotional gratification and balance in their lives rather than the economic side of it.
So I'm not going to get too personal, but just this one question. How many people in this room have had a child? Raise your hand.
A child.
Had, or one or more.
One or more.
Well, you know what I mean. Been party to the having of a child. I just made at least half, maybe 2/3 of the people in the room have been party to the having of a child. Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Having to take a census.
No more questions.
Take a census here. No more questions about your marital status when you did. All right, you and then you. Okay, go ahead. Is it on?
It's not on.
I can't tell.
Now?
Too much.
Great. Leslie Poole with the Seed Foundation.
Right.
So let's say I start with the premise that I agree with you, right? And that I want to share this. I just wonder, have you done any work to really help your audience sort of, have you done any work around emotional intelligence or equity, right? Because I imagine that the message could seem pretty offensive. I think it'd be more than my feelings would be hurt. I'd probably be offended if it's just not my orientation. And so I wonder if in presenting the curriculum or presenting this opportunity to learn this skill, that you've done any work around sort of IQ or equity so that the message can be received.
So the Dibble Institute has a series that I mentioned in my talk where they embed their lessons about the success sequence in other skills that they're helping the kids to acquire. Those are things like how to tell when you're in an unhealthy relationship, what can you expect from other people, how to be a good friend, all of those kinds of things, conflict resolution. And so it's all sort of packaged in a way that is non-threatening and meant to build up the skills of the individual to have a happy and successful life, and even right now, not even thinking about the future, but skills for getting through high school in a more satisfying way.
Let me put you on the spot for a second. You've got, because seed schools have kids for most of their life, that is during the years they have them, not just from 9 to 3. Are the seed schools and the counselors and people that you have imparting these kinds of messages to the kids who are with you?
I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to let my colleague answer that
Sure.
question. So I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But
Because residential gives you a lot more time with kids.
Hi, Vincina Allen with the Seed Foundation.
Welcome.
I think the thing that resonates with me the most is that essentially you're talking about the importance of wraparound support. And that is something that is core to the work that we're doing at Seed. And so we really are looking at addressing the whole child, which I believe, to your point, goes beyond academic readiness. Providing them with options and giving them opportunities to have a successful life. For us at Seed, it's preparing them for success in college and beyond. Nonetheless, you know, it is a success sequence for us, and we believe that the only way that it can happen is through wraparound support.
Okay. Thank you for that. One more question, and then we're going to take a short break, and then it's the next game in our doubleheader. Who are you?
Oh, I'm Emily from the Progressive Policy Institute, and I'm not doubting the success of the sequence. What I'm curious about is there any research on if you kind of postpone parts of the sequence to like your upper 20s is even more successful? Only because we said adolescents aren't great decision makers. I'm not entirely convinced people in their early 20s are great decision makers, and I just think that you could actually follow that sequence and still have children by the time you were 21, like before you could drink, if all you're talking about is getting a full-time job, not graduating college.
So,
Maybe there should be 43.
it was like the dad who was willing to let his daughter start dating when she was 60, you know. Well, the data, the answer to that question, I know, are embedded in the very comprehensive report that Wendy Wang and Brad Wilcox put out in their work on the millennials. They break it down every which way, so you can find it. So I really don't think, though, and don't hold me to this, but my impression was there isn't a vast difference in terms of life outcomes, whether you have children in your early 20s when you're married, or your late 20s, or your 30s when you're married. It's the marriage part that's key.
Join me in thanking Mona. We're going to take a 5-minute stretch and refresh break, and then Ramesh and Mike will be up here.
5 o'clock, the bar is open.
The bar is open. 5
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Mike Petrilli. I'm the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a visiting fellow here at the Hoover Institution. Those of you watching at home, I will say that here in D.C. in the live event, it is 5 o'clock and we are drinking wine and beer, so you should feel free to do the same as well. No preachiness from us on this particular topic. We are making a transition from one topic to another that may seem like they don't have a lot in common, but I will say this. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to take some time and work on a book called Education for Upward Mobility, an edited volume, kind of stepping back and asking, okay, those of us in the education reform movement, are we really thinking about this challenge the right way? So much of our focus when it came to how to help low-income kids, working-class kids, climb the ladder, experience the American dream, and climb that ladder to the middle class was about college. And of course, we all know that there's tons of evidence that if you're poor and you do get a four-year college degree, your chances of getting into the middle class are very, very good. It seemed like it makes sense. The problem is we're terrible at actually helping most low-income kids complete 4 years of college and then get into the middle class. And as we dug into the research and read a lot of the great folks that have been speaking at this series and others, what became clear was the success sequence came up, of course, that if we really care about getting low-income kids into the middle class, there is this other pathway that doesn't involve college, right? You notice success sequence, the three pieces are finish your high school degree at least, get a full-time job, and then marriage before children, not go to college. And when I was doing some of that research and I would talk to people like Isabel Sawhill and Ron Haskins, they would always tell me, they'd always say, we just can't understand you education reform people. You are obsessed with college. Why is that? Those of us in the broader social sciences who think about social policy, we love career and technical education. That's where we've got strong evidence. The Career Academy studies showing these incredible long-term impacts on helping low-income kids get into the middle class, on even boosting marriage rates. There's a study, kids that went through career academies, years later, they were more likely to be married and to have to be living in the same home as their kids. And so these twin issues, this issue around the success sequence and about delaying parenting, super important, and this issue around the focus on work. That by all means, college, again, great pathway for many people to the middle class, but not the only pathway. There's this other pathway, and it is a good paying job, jobs that are out there, and that we're going to hear from Ramesh that we could be preparing more kids for if we weren't just preaching the college for all idea. Ramesh Ponnuru is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the future of conservatism with a particular focus on healthcare, economic policy, and constitutionalism. Love it. Also senior editor for National Review, where he has covered national politics and public policy for 20 years, and a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, and a contributor to CBS News. You see him writing all over the place and on lots of television stations, talking about all the important issues of the day. But today, he is going to talk about this important issue, about why those of us in education and in social policy writ large need to get beyond our college for all fetish. So Ramesh, come on up, and please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to thank Fordham and Hoover for giving me this opportunity to speak and for inviting me to think about a question in a somewhat different way than I have before, which is always a nice experience. I don't thank them for putting me after Mona, which is a tough burden for me to bear, but they've made up for it by giving you all an opportunity to have a drink, which might compensate. In his 2010 State of the Union address, President Barack Obama said that in this economy, a high school diploma no longer guarantees a good job. And he urged Congress to take various steps to make college, including community college, more affordable. Obama's predecessor, President George W. Bush, had different positions from him on many issues, but the two saw eye to eye on this basic point. Accepting his party's presidential nomination for a second time in 2004, Bush lamented that too few Americans completed even 2 years of college and pledged to help more Americans start their career with a college diploma. Both of them were speaking from within a decades-long bipartisan consensus. That American consensus has viewed a college education as a prerequisite for both individual and national success. As the wages of Americans with college degrees have pulled away from those of Americans without them, parents and policymakers alike have considered it vital for young people to follow high school with college. That way, those young people can capture the wage premium, and the economy can reap the benefits of a skilled, which is to say a schooled, population. Colleges have long been widely respected institutions, and they naturally agree with this perspective, even apart from their material interest in it. So they tend to reinforce it, and they may do so more actively in coming years as demographic change reduces college enrollment and forces many colleges out of operation. The consensus that sending more young people to college should be our priority has frayed a little in recent years at the edges, but it remains strong. If you go to the homepage of the website for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you'll see that one of their missions is, quote, to increase students' college completion rates. Clicking on that mission takes you to another page that outlines the foundation goal: to ensure that all students who seek the opportunity are able to complete a high-quality, affordable post-secondary education that leads to a sustaining career. Scroll down a little further, and the foundation explains that its college-ready education program aims to ensure that all students graduate from high school prepared to succeed in college and in a career. All students. Well, our government, and one might say our culture, have made a concerted effort to increase the number of young people who attend college. For a long time, that strategy arguably succeeded. College degree attainment rates rose for several decades. That rise coincided with a massive increase in the wealth of the nation, and especially the part of it with degrees, and it made sense that these trends would coincide. But the strategy may have hit a point of diminishing returns and hit it well short of where we might have hoped. Some of our apparent success in raising enrollment rates has taken the form of putting young people who are not ready for college in colleges. As of 2009, nearly half of all college students had taken at least one remedial course within 6 years of entry. The figure for community colleges was nearly 70%. Dropout rates are quite high. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, more than 1/3 of the students who enrolled in four-year colleges in 2003 had failed to receive a degree within the next 6 years. The same was true of nearly 2/3 of those who enrolled in community colleges. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports the good news. The wages of people who went to college but were not graduated are higher than the wages of people who never went to college at all. Less encouragingly, it reports that their wages are nonetheless closer to those of high school dropouts than they are to those of college graduates. And this some college group, unlike the high school dropouts, has student loan debt. Even among those who do earn college degrees, many don't take jobs that require those degrees. In a recent paper for the Manhattan Institute, Orrin Cass pointed to research showing that more than 1/3 of employed college graduates work in jobs for which the majority of job holders did not consider a college degree necessary. He also noted research from Burning Glass Technologies and the Strada Institute, which used a slightly different definition of underemployment, but concluded that close to half of those college graduates whose first job doesn't require a degree are still in jobs that don't require a degree 10 years later. For all the emphasis on the necessity of a college education, moreover, 43% of high school students aren't enrolling in college in the first place. Cass calculates from the data that only 16% of ninth graders will make it through college to a job that requires a college degree, which is to say that only a small minority of young people will follow the education to career path that our system treats as an ideal. These disappointing results have caused many people to have second thoughts about whether we should be quite so single-minded about funneling students from high school to college. They should have this chastening effect. They should have it even if we put no weight on Brian Kaplan's argument that the wage premium from schooling mostly reflects the signal that diplomas provide about a prospective employee's intelligence, studiousness, and conformity to social norms, rather than reflecting the skills and knowledge that schools impart. To the extent that we do accept Kaplan's analysis, we have even more reason to think that neither government nor society should be seeking to raise college enrollment, or at least seeking it quite so avidly. My own skepticism about college as the main or only route to making a good living has led me to write about questions of public policy that affect people after high school. My point has not been that we should simply stop telling people to go to college, hope that fewer people decide to enroll, and call it a day. What we should be trying to do instead is clearing pathways for people who don't go to college to be able to make livelihoods and contribute to their communities. And so I've written favorably, for example, about proposals by some members of Congress to change the rules that govern the accreditation of colleges in order to give graduating high school seniors more options, the hope being that some of them might work better than the traditional options. Liberalizing occupational licensure rules is another idea that might open pathways to economic success that are particularly beneficial to those without college degrees. And I'd add that governments at all levels should give serious consideration to relaxing educational requirements for various job categories and thus allowing people without college degrees to fill more of their positions. But of course, whether we think that everyone should go to college has major implications for how we should think about primary and especially about secondary education. It affects the very purpose of K-12. Very often, I think policymakers, educators, and parents primarily conceive of that purpose as making sure that students are ready for college. Worse, in practice, they sometimes assume that it's making sure that students enroll in college, ready or not. This assumption has a way of insinuating itself easily into our schools. Third grade follows second, middle school follows elementary school, and at each step, a teacher's job is in some sense to help ready a child for that next step. That next step is predetermined. It is in key ways the same for all children, and it takes place at a school. And so there's a natural assumption that college enrollment should be the next step. It's an assumption that is not always made consciously. It was an influence in 2015 when a Republican Congress passed and a Democratic president signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, legislation that amended and reauthorized the federal government's major K-12 programs. Among many, many other things, the act requires that states publish report cards that include any information they collect about the percentage of each high school's graduates who enroll at post-secondary institutions. States are not required to include any information about completion rates or about employment rates. The website for the Federal Department of Education has a page about this law that explains how it builds on recent progress, and it offers 3 examples of that recent progress. It says high school graduation rates are at all-time highs. Dropout rates are at historic lows. You may notice that these first 2 examples are in fact the same thing, said twice. The passage continues, and more students are going to college than ever before. These achievements provide a firm foundation for further work to expand educational opportunity and improve student outcomes under ESSA. Well, it's safe to say that that language was not designed to be controversial. It was written and approved by people to whom it has almost certainly never occurred that getting more people to go to college isn't an accomplishment at all, let alone the only post-high school accomplishment worth noting. Moving away from a college-centric model for K-12 would require a different conception of the purpose of K-12. What follows 12th grade, the next step, the next phase for which each grade has been a preparation, should not necessarily be college. It should be adulthood. Primary and secondary schools should aid parents in getting children ready to make responsible choices about what to do with their lives. Those schools should inculcate in them the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that will help them make wise choices, choices that are informed both about their options and about themselves. This mission is very different from preparing all children to make one obvious next step. Under this conception of the purpose of schools, our criteria for success would also have to be different. A good high school would no longer be one in which a high percentage of graduating seniors go to college in the fall. It would be one in which a high percentage of graduating seniors either complete college within a few years or find gainful employment. Using this measure of success, a high school would get credit when its graduates were truly ready for college, but it wouldn't get credit when graduates who aren't ready or don't have the aptitude or the interest enroll in college. I'll admit that this proposed measure of mine isn't a perfect one. A focus on college graduation rates could become a reason for colleges to lower standards. A focus on high school graduation rates has sometimes had this effect. Collecting this information and using it to judge high schools would, of course, be more administratively difficult than gauging enrollment rates. But that's not an argument for adopting or maintaining the wrong measure of success. And keeping an eye on how well schools are preparing students for college or the labor market would also tend to counteract the negative side effects of the focus on high school graduation rates. The incentive would be to make the high school diploma valuable once again to employers. If high schools were successful in this task, perhaps employers would start screening job applicants for college degrees a little bit less often. In a world where success were defined in terms of college completion or employment rather than matriculation rates, administrators seeking to improve their high school's reputation would have a stronger incentive to devote attention to the non-college bound portion of their student bodies. They would also have an incentive to steer students toward the path most likely to work for them. Ideally, they would avoid heavy-handed tracking. But that danger doesn't justify a status quo that is in its own way heavy-handed and that is failing many young people. The reorientation of schools I'm recommending also suggests a need for changes in academic standards and curricula. A few years ago, Andrew Kelly, then a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute, noted that the Common Core standards are supposed to promote both college and career readiness. But instead of defining career ready separately, he wrote, the architects have equated the two. Well, nobody can doubt that there's a lot of overlap between what students need to learn for college and what they need to learn for a career that doesn't involve college. All students should be literate, know basic math, science, and civics, have some familiarity with art, literature, and history. All students should be supported, too, in forming habits of mind and conduct, including honesty and industry, that will help them become upright citizens. As I noted earlier, they need those things to form them as adults capable of choosing how to spend their adulthood. Yet it would be a surprising coincidence if the things students need to learn for college turned out to be identical to what they need to learn for a career that doesn't involve going to college. A similar confusion afflicts even those who've been moving away from the College for All model, which suggests to me both that we're in the early stages of a rethinking and that this model retains a very powerful grip on our minds. Recall that the Gates Foundation has a program designed to ensure that all high school students are prepared to succeed at college and a career. Again, the excluded possibility is that students may be prepared to succeed at a career without being prepared to succeed at college. The foundation has another program whose goal, it explains, is to dramatically increase the number of young people who obtain a post-secondary degree or certificate with labor market value. Well, those final words about or a certificate with labor market value are a laudable acknowledgement that college degrees aren't for everyone. But there's a tension between these two programs' goals. If a significant fraction of high school students are going to go on to earn a certificate with labor market value rather than earning a college degree, why do all of them need to be ready for success in college? One way out of that conflict is suggested by a less well-known nonprofit organization now named Peer Forward, but formerly called College Summit. That group takes partial credit for the ESSA's inclusion of the requirement that states report every high school's post-secondary enrollment rate. The group says, we have finally reached consensus as a nation on the post-secondary purpose of the American high school. High school graduation is now a milestone on the way to matriculation. It is no longer the end point. But it then explains that it wants us to revise our understanding of college. Instead of picturing a leafy four-year campus adorned with brick buildings, tweed-clad professors, and strolling students with time to read, reflect, and yes, play, it says, we should have in mind a new definition: any post-secondary educational experience with value in the marketplace. The group goes on, however, to say that it's important for colleges and universities to award both more four-year degrees and more post-secondary certificates. I agree that our view of college should not be restricted to tweed and brick. I would like somebody to do some historical research on the last time that the percentage of professors who wore tweed exceeded 50. One of the benefits of changing the accreditation rules, as I mentioned earlier, would be to enable a greater variety of post-secondary institutions. But I would hope that this broader mindedness would lead further rather than stopping at that point. If we want to say that college degrees are not for everyone, which is what we should want to say, perhaps we should just say it, instead of trying to change the meaning of the word college. Perhaps we should consider, too, whether it's right to think that a path to success without a traditional college degree has to involve getting a formal certificate for training efforts begun after high school. Might it be possible for preparation to begin during high school? Even after high school, might a young person's actual provision of labor market value, that is, his working a job, sometimes be at least as valuable a credential as his possession of any piece of paper at all? And while we're thinking through the question of college and career readiness, might the term career itself indicate too narrow a way of thinking about students' futures? A lot of students don't want and won't have the kind of employment path that the term career can connote. Skeptics of the College for All template for success typically call for an expansion of apprenticeships and of career and technical education, although given what I've just said, maybe it would be better to go back to the unjustly discarded label of vocational education. And I am going to conform to that pattern. I think it is highly appropriate for governments to redirect some of the money they now spend trying to get young people to get college degrees to those young people who don't. And what makes that case especially compelling is that the major beneficiaries of the current spending, the people who actually receive the degrees and then have careers that require them, have much better economic outcomes as a group than those who don't. I'm no expert on how best to design and support such programs. I do think that hands-on experience working for an employer could be valuable for many students, less because it is a form of training for a specific job than because it helps them get used to the world of work. And as an aside, my strong sense is that nearly all students, whatever path they're looking forward to, could use more instruction than they currently get in personal finance. But I would again raise the caution that College for All assumptions can easily sneak back into our thinking about these programs. There is nothing wrong with a participant in one of these programs choosing to go to college. But we shouldn't judge these programs by their effect on college enrollment rates, and we shouldn't try to structure them so as to boost those college enrollment rates. Defenders of College for All frequently suggest that the critics are elitists who wish to let only a select few through the doors of universities and reserve the great benefits of the universities to that few fortunate minority. These defenders observe that many of the skeptics are themselves college graduates and that their children typically follow the college track. David Leonhardt, for example, has sounded this note in the New York Times. The critics shouldn't be intimidated by this charge. They could even, in a way, fling it back at their accusers. A system oriented towards college enrollment already works, mostly for the advantage of a select few. This system leads us too often to ignore or condescend to those who are uninterested in following that path. My point isn't that everybody who believes that we should try to get more people to go to college is a snob, but the adherents of that view should reckon with the way in which they have fostered a culture in which people without degrees are sometimes written off as losers. The truth is that our debates on all sides of education policy are dominated by people who have college degrees and who expect their children to earn them as well. People whose degrees come from the very most selective colleges have vastly disproportionate influence in these debates and don't always appreciate how few Americans go to such schools. These facts distort our thinking about education, even though almost all the people involved have good intentions. The distortion has gotten worse as the country's social life has become more stratified on the basis of education. The policymakers, the journalists, the think tankers who talk about education have to stretch to imagine what the world looks like to people who don't share their educational goals and assumptions. A more pluralistic approach would be compatible with targeted efforts to identify young people who aren't bound for college, but whom we have good reason to think would benefit from it. And it would help them apply, arrange financing, and so forth. We could, for example, make it easier for them to make income share agreements that would enable them to go to college, or, for that matter, of course, to follow a non-college track. The point is that what is right for some is not right for all. Parents, including upper middle class parents who themselves have college degrees, should be open to the possibility that college may not be a good fit for all of their children. And as they help their children determine their options, they should be cognizant of our low college completion rates. Overall, our goal should be to open, not close, doors to opportunity. Those doors are not found exclusively on college campuses. A K-12 education is not a failure if it leads somewhere else. And in all of our thinking about grade schools, let us not lose sight of that truth. Thank you.
Okay, great job, Ramesh.
Thank you.
Now enjoy your wine. Anybody out there can get another one if you want. Yes. Okay, well, let's get into some of this. First, I want to pick up on something you just said about parents. You know, there's a ton of data out there where pollsters ask parents about their own aspirations for their kids. And not surprisingly, overwhelmingly, I mean, like to the degree of like 90% of parents will say they want their child to go to college. You know, maybe some of those parents don't have a four-year degree in mind, but let's assume that a lot of parents, and you ask kids, you get the same results. Now, those numbers start to go down somewhat as kids get older. You know, so, you know, first grade parents, everybody wants a kid to go to college. Maybe by high school it goes down some. But what do you make of that? I mean, do we need to change the mind of parents out there? Is that part of what this rethinking is about, is changing the culture so that maybe we don't have that groupthink about college anymore?
Absolutely, I think that's right. It's not just a question of policymakers who are imposing this mindset on people. It is a very widely shared kind of cultural norm in our country. As I mentioned, it's particularly strong in the upper middle class in our country, but I think it's strong nationwide. And we have to ask, is this mindset actually serving everybody? Now, one interesting thing, I've seen very little polling on this question, but I have seen some polling which suggests if you ask people just which should be our higher priority, getting more people to go to college or opening up pathways for people who don't go to college, there's actually a pretty strong majority support for option number 2 rather than option number 1.
And it's interesting, sometimes you could say that people feel comfortable saying, well, for other people's kids, there should be all these other options. But they will still say about my own kid, I want them to go to college. And again, back to the success sequence, it's a little bit interesting. You have everybody aspires for marriage. I mean, you do the polling, you know, you don't have people out there saying that I don't want to be married someday, or I would, you know, most people say, yes, someday I'd like to be married before having children. But right now, it's only the upper middle class and some of the middle class that seems to be achieving that at high rates. And you could say the same thing about college, right? We have this aspiration, but then we don't quite make it. You know, I've certainly made these arguments as well about let's be open to alternatives to college. And what I have found is that most people are certainly by the idea that, okay, if somebody's 18, they've got a high school diploma, and they decide they don't want to go to college, fine. You know, most people are okay with that. Or certainly if they don't have the reading and math skills to be successful in college, most people will say, okay, we understand pushing them to go to college is a bad idea. But the minute you say that earlier in the process, in 9th or 10th grade, somebody should, in your words, I think you said steer them towards a pathway that is not college, and suddenly you bring up the tracking boogeyman, people overwhelmingly get freaked out. And you can understand, certainly there's a long history in this country of our high schools being racist and classist, and that tracking system definitely saying, based on the color of your skin or where you live, you go over here. And certainly conservatives would say, look, we've got a terrible history in the Soviet Union, other places, of having these systems that also tried to make decisions for young people. So say more about, you said a little bit about how we need to get over that tracking concern, but let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, these seem to be reasonable worries.
So, yeah, there's absolutely is a concern about and sensitivity about tracking, and it takes different forms and different points in the political spectrum, but it is widespread. I think I had debated, partly for that reason, when I was thinking about these remarks, saying the key thing should be to create these alternatives and these options, and not say anything about steering kids toward the right option. But I just think that's unrealistic. I think one way or the other, there are, if you've got a high school counselor who's talking to a student, they're inevitably going to be pushing in one direction or another, maybe implicitly, maybe gently. So I'd say two things about this. One, I do think it's very important that the fundamental choice, whatever pressure or influence or advice is being given, the fundamental choice has to be made by the student and the student's family.
Right.
And when you think about sort of other countries' systems, there's more comfort with a greater degree of central direction.
Yeah.
Like, you take this test, okay, there you go. I don't think that that's going to make sense. I don't think that would ever fly in this country. So in that sense, maybe it's not even a real danger. But the second thing I would say is that what I said is that the fear of tracking is not a justification for the status quo. And maybe another way of looking at it is that what we already have is a kind of tracking. It's just that we put everybody on the same track. And it's a track that not only doesn't work for everybody, it doesn't even work for the median student.
Right. Which is, I mean, you look at the data, and it's right. That median student is the exact kind of student who will go to college and will drop out.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. Now, another argument that people push back on is they say, look, well, if, in today's labor market, you have to have some kind of post-secondary training, okay? At the very least, the certificates, some piece of paper, like it or not, that you can take to an employer that indicates that you've got some skill that's valuable. It's just really hard to identify good jobs where you can show up at age 18 and June after your senior year with a high school diploma and get a decent paying job that's not gonna that has some real prospects. So I mean, do you buy that argument? I mean, is that what do you say to somebody who makes that case?
Well, I would say, first of all, that even today there are quite a few jobs that don't require that kind of credentialing in which people have been successful. But to the extent that it's true, and there is an extent to it's true, we've identified a problem rather than a given that we sort of have to accept and build our system around. And I think it is a problem that is significantly influenced by the way our system has set up, right? So, I mean, we have devalued the high school diploma, for example. We have we've tried to make it so that sort of the top third of our young people cognitively go to colleges and maybe try at least to get the degree. And
what the problem is also that employers out there, too many of them are asking for degrees or certificates even when they don't need it.
So again, so as I was suggesting, I mean, I do think there's the potential that if you create some of these alternatives, you make it so that some of these non-college degrees have more value in the labor market.
Now, one bubble you talked about was that most of us went to college or elite colleges. I think Princeton was here on your resume. Yes. All right. So we're in this bubble, but the other bubble is we're here on the coasts, D.C. or New York or the San Francisco Bay Area, where, look, there isn't a big middle class, you could argue. I mean, at least there does feel like a big divide between, the highly educated professionals making a lot of money, and then the service sector tends to be fairly low skilled, not making much money, and there's huge challenges there. But you get outside these areas, and you go out to most of America, where there's still manufacturing, or there's mining, or there's lots of other opportunities. In the middle, the economy looks pretty different. So, I mean, is this kind of a red state, blue state issue, or maybe you need, maybe if you need one approach for these deep blue cities, but something else would work better for the rest of the country?
Yeah, speaking of my own education, I was just earlier in this week, I was halfway through reading an article about married couples where the wife is more educated than the husband, where the language in it was where the wife married down educationally. Yeah. And I realized, oh wait, I'm in one of those marriages, actually, since I never got anything after my college degree. I would say, so should there be a sort of a blue state model and a red state model? I think there should be a lot more than two models. Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't think that it would make sense to have a kind of central approach where, states can pick either option A or option B. I think we have to have experimentation, and that, different schools are going to take different approaches, and if they're sort of rightly influenced by a rethinking of these fundamental premises, and some of them will work and some of them won't. I do expect you would find a pattern where, in places where sort of the college track seems to make more sense, you would probably have more people going to college, and where it doesn't, you wouldn't. And of course, that's already the case.
Yeah. I mean, this dynamic. You hear this all the time from some rural schools, that this push on college it just didn't fit in some cases. They felt like if they sent their kids off to college, they were never going to come back, and so that's tough, especially in places that are depopulated, right? Whereas there may be some good middle skilled jobs in some of these places, but so more technical training would work. But let's talk a little bit though about the politics of this. I mean, you have indicated that there's been some fraying around this College for All consensus, but it's still largely in place. I don't know. I would say that in the last few years there's been a huge shift, and part of that is because of the politics. That the people who voted for Donald Trump, or at least Donald Trump country out there, really resonates with this notion that it's the elites on the coast that have been looking down on them for not having a college degree. I remember Marco Rubio talking about, people should be able to get trained as a welder instead of a philosopher. You've got governors, actually both parties, if they talk about anything about education right now, it's career and technical education. There's sort of this sense that, that the politics of this have shifted dramatically, that politicians are trying to signal to people without college degrees, to the working class, that they're with them. I mean, how do you make sense of all that?
Well, I don't think that the politics have shifted that dramatically. I don't think that a political message that appeared to be sort of hostile to having young people go to college would be successful.
Okay.
For example, it is certainly true that you've got a deepening political divide between people with college degrees and people without college degrees, with the some college group being the kind of plurality in the middle. It's actually kind of interesting because income and education correlate positively with each other. The more educated you are these days, the more likely you are to vote Democratic. But the higher income you are, you're still more likely in any particular state to be voting Republican. So I've just got to assume that if you didn't go to college and you're rich, you must be just off the charts Republican. You must be getting like 90%.
No, that's right. Those people are small business owners.
Yeah, I haven't seen survey data on that particular slice of the public, but
let's talk about that, because a cynic out there would say, well, see, these conservative guys are now saying, oh, well, now that people with college degrees are voting for Democrats and voting for progressives, that's why they don't want people to go to college, because college turns people into liberals.
So the idea that sort of colleges are kind of liberal factories.
Yeah.
I guess so. If I would not advise conservative politicians to make policy on that basis, because I think some of the causal leaps there are highly speculative.
Yes.
Our understanding of why people who went to college and have the degrees end up voting more liberally is pretty underdeveloped, for one thing. And exactly what the effects of some of these things would be are a little unclear as well. So let's say, we adopted some of the recommendations that I talked about and sort of like-minded suggestions. Now, presumably, this means that some of the people who are in the some college category go in a sort of a slightly different direction here.
Right.
Well, what does that do, right? I mean, how does that change their voting behavior? It's not at all clear to me what the answer. And if we're wrong, right? If the analysis that I'm giving is wrong here, then the net effect of these recommendations is to make the college degree scarcer. Well, doesn't that just raise the premium and actually help all of these college graduates, all these blue state voters? So it's very interesting. It's the kind of thing we love talking about, but
Yes.
but it's also kind of wispy on an evidentiary basis.
Right. All right, that's fair. But the notion that the culture at least may be shifting some to say that, look, it is a problem if people feel like they're being condescended to because they don't have a college degree. Right. That it used to be that, look, if you're doing your job, you're working hard, you're putting food on your family's table, you deserve our respect.
To the extent that the elections, particularly Trump's election, showed a degree of unhappiness in the country with the system, and with the educational system being a big part of that, then maybe it has opened up a little bit of opportunity for us to talk about some of these questions in a new and hopefully more constructive way.
All right, I want to get the audience in here, so think of your questions and raise your hand if you've got one. And if you're watching via the video, send me a tweet, #Ed2020, and I will take a peek and see what you got. I've got one last question while you're thinking about yours. Back to the labor market. Last argument people make, this all might be fine and good for today's economy, but the robots are coming, and they're going to take all our jobs, except for the jobs of people who can learn to learn and who are adaptive, and that means people who have a strong liberal arts background. And that's why we need lots more people going to college. What do you think?
Yeah. So I'm just really skeptical of the idea that this widely claimed for benefit of liberal education actually exists. That colleges are so great at inculcating these critical thinking skills to people. It doesn't seem to be working out so well for the 43% of people who don't go to college, or the large number of people who start and don't finish. And then I'm further skeptical that it's the sort of thing that you can't get in other ways. So, I understand why people make this claim, but I think that there's a kind of wishfulness to it that outpaces the evidence for it.
Do you worry about the robots?
Sometimes I think that if a robot could take over the job of a lot of the punditry, that might be
Yes, that would be great.
that might be better for everybody.
Robo pundit.
Involved.
I like it. Okay, yes, sir.
Carl Polzar, fantastic talk. Thank you very much. So I think we're in a different position than we were 10 years ago in terms of, the job market. There are all these jobs you read about that are out there that they can't match with anybody. Is anybody doing any research on, how could we train somebody to help get them those jobs? Number one. And then the other thing is on the robots. I mean, those machines that clean your hands, in the toilets are robots. Half of them don't work. But we've been having that's the whole process of technology development. And in that sphere, we have this tremendous change going on with computers, and the colleges don't even know how to teach it. In fact, my daughter's taking at George Mason. Now they're starting to get into the game of big data, and then they work on a job at the same time. So I mean, are there other things we could be doing to adapt as the new technology comes on to fit people for these jobs where they would go to school, and then also be matched with an employer, and be put into the workforce?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense as a question. Whether I have a good answer for it is a different question. But sort of maybe further thoughts on the automation point. One, I am skeptical of the idea that this time is different. That this time technological development is going to destroy a bunch of jobs, and there won't be new jobs that are created that are at least as good to fill the vacuum. I think that there's actually a better case that technological development has been too slow than that it's too fast. And one thought that occurs to me is that if you expand sort of CTE's type of education and apprenticeships and the sort of non-college track of skills development, it's a much better platform for retraining if somebody gets disrupted out of a job than colleges, than telling somebody when they're 45, well, you need to come up with this whole new career path, and that involves going back to college, which is completely unsuited to you. It just seems like that to the extent we take seriously that model of sort of what the new economy is going to be like, we should be moving further away from a college-centric model.
So I agree with most everything you said, but I'm a little curious because you didn't really mention the role of higher education in this in terms of the responsibility of higher education institutions for this kind of failure. In that, I know there's been great inflation, a lot of pushing kids into college, and I get that, but there's also been pockets of really great schools, particularly here in DC, a lot of our charter schools, where kids are getting into college through rigorous programs, low-income kids in particular. And yet they're still not succeeding, largely because higher education institutions seem to refuse to accept the fact that a lot of their new students are non-traditional. They're still designed for kids with huge parental support, whose parents have been to college. And I'm just curious if you think that higher education reform might also play a role in your vision.
Yeah, so I deliberately focused on the sort of the K-12 piece of it, but I think there's absolutely a lot that needs to be done in the higher education space. And, I think part of it, I very, very briefly alluded to the fact that, it's possible to maybe search out people who are currently not getting the message about how they can go to college. And, the program, I think Mona mentioned, for example, the people who are not aware that there are scholarships available to them if they choose to go to college. There are all kinds of things that could be done. Colleges should be making more of an effort to identify the students who are having trouble and trying to get them out of trouble. I don't have the sense that a lot of institutions have made that a priority. My cynical view or cynical suspicion is that a lot of institutions are perfectly happy to string students along for year after year and keep getting the money. So there's all kinds of things that the institutions themselves should do. I think there are all kinds of things that policymakers can do with respect to higher education. I am one of those who advocates skin in the game when it comes to loans. It seems to me that if your institution, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, is turning out a lot of people who are defaulting on their loans, it shouldn't be just the taxpayer who makes up for that, but the institution itself should get dinged in some ways on that. Now, that's going to be enormously controversial with the institutions, but nothing I said should imply that I think that everything's hunky-dory in the realm of higher education policy itself.
Ramesh, when I think about this idea of 18-year-olds going out into the real world, it makes me a little nervous. I mean, no, they're not, teenagers aren't kids, but I'm not quite sure, are they adults yet? I know that's so young. College, you get this nice bubble of letting people get a little bit older and have all these experiences, but for kids not going to college, the military is a great option for many people. It does a fantastic job building skills in all kinds of ways. Do we need something else? I mean, people talk about national service as maybe being something we should embrace for young people, an alternative to the military, build skills, grow up a little, get some great experience, give back. I mean, what do you think about all that?
I think our nervousness is to a large degree socially conditioned.
Okay.
And that we overestimate to the extent to which Americans growing up happens in college.
And,
All right.
you know,
They do get older, at least. Yes.
to the extent that it seems like kids have to be older to,
Yeah.
you know, be actual adults,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
we've come
yeah,
up with adults as a verb now.
yeah.
It is partly because we treat people as kids for a longer and longer time. Now, look, I mean, maybe there are some good reasons for that. I mean, you know, I would not suggest, you know, kids going to work at 7 and being treated as responsible. You know, I'm not talking about going back to the pre-industrial or the early industrial revolution in that respect, but I do think that that maybe we've gone a little bit overboard in not treating adults as adults.
National service? Not your thing?
Well, you know, Bill Buckley, my great founder of National, he wrote a book in favor of national service. I am so skeptical of the government, the federal government in particular, and it seems to be doing more and more to justify skepticism, that I don't incline toward that.
We'll say our national parks need a good cleaning right now. I understand. All right. Well, do we have time for one more? All right, it's got to be quick, super fast, with the mic.
That perhaps the private sector has a role to play in creating alternative pathways. What do you think about, say, apprenticeship programs, as Western Europe often has highly skilled, high-wage apprenticeship programs that can lead non-college graduates along toward a pathway toward success?
Yeah, I think in general, I am in favor of a major expansion of these programs. I suspect that they're going to have to take somewhat different form in the United States than in European countries, partly because of the way those systems mesh with their educational systems and our very different educational system, and are, you know, as we were discussing with the tracking concerns in this country, which I think are much stronger than they are in other places. Absolutely, I think that there's a role for the private sector to play here, and I also think, you know, I think that there are reasons why employers have decided to screen as heavily as they do for the college diploma. And there are some reasonable considerations there. There's some good reasons for that, but I do wonder whether this sort of culture-wide mindset about college that is in some respects irrational has made employers a little too prone to do that, and maybe they ought to reconsider how much they do that.
All right, please join me in thanking Ramesh. Great comments. And Mona as well. That concludes our program. We will be back again for the next event in this series in February. I believe that Yuval Levin, who was here, will be one of our speakers, and the other is Elliot Cohn. Okay, I'm looking at Checker. I think that is right. So another great doubleheader. Look for information about that coming to you soon. And until then, be safe and enjoy that government closure, you federal employees, if you're out there. All right, thank you. Thanks, Ramesh.
All right, that was fun.
Yeah.